So Mexico lies to the south of the United States. It's a large and very diverse country. It has, of course, east and west coasts, Pacific and Caribbean, and varied habitats ranging from desert through savannas to rainforest and high mountains. And as you can see from the species totals there, it's a very diverse country for wildlife, with well over 1,000 bird species on its list and over 2,000 butterfly species. The area I'm going to focus on lies between Mexico City and the west coast, near the holiday resort of Puerto Vallarta. We're going to start on the outskirts of Mexico City. Then we're going to move about 50 miles west to the state of Michoacan to look for monarch butterflies. And then we're going to move to Banderas Bay on the west coast near Puerto Vallarta. And finally, another roughly 50 miles north to the San Blas area, very popular area for finding endemic birds and a popular North American birders destination. So here's Mexico City. It's vast. It has a population of over 21 million. The traffic is awful. And to be honest, I was quite glad to get out on my last trip in February 2020, just as coronavirus hit Mexico City. So I think I escaped with a slender margin there. So we're going to start our journey actually about 30 miles northeast of Mexico City at a place with a wonderful name of Teotihuacan, which, as you can see there, translates roughly as the place where the gods were created. It's pre-Aztec in origin. It's big. It's roughly 8 square miles. The Avenue of the Dead that you can see in the centre of the picture there is about 2 miles long, and we're looking there at the Pyramid of the Sun, which is the 3rd largest pyramid in the world. And it's a good place to both see the archaeological remains, of course, and get a flavour for the birds and other wildlife present here. You can ascend the Pyramid of the Sun and look from the base of the Pyramid of the Moon here. And early in the mornings there's quite often a fleet of hot air balloons from which other visitors take a slightly different view of the site. So it's a good place to familiarise yourself with the common birds hereabouts. So there's a male house finch, a widespread North American passerine, and much larger, a great-tailed grackle, a very common member of the so-called blackbirds, which aren't related to European blackbirds at all, but quite noisy, very sociable birds. There are a number of dove species. This is a common species called the white-winged dove that has large white patches in its wings visible in flight. And then much smaller, not a lot bigger than a sparrow really, the Inca dove. And here the mourning dove, a common North American species that mostly vacates North America, or at least the United States and Canada, for the winter. This one is puffed up and is singing. You can hardly fail to see this fantastic vermilion flycatcher, which is common around Teotihuacan, perching on prominent places like this agave. It truly is a real stunner of a bird. Females with a little bit of pink and grey, to be honest, not quite so flashy, but equally conspicuous. Also hunting insects, though in the case of this bird, the Cassin's kingbird, they'll be looking for larger flying insects and maybe grasshoppers and the like. Also looking, no doubt, for insects and perhaps other prey, a pair of loggerhead shrikes. There are a good many North American birds passing through Mexico en route to Central America and South America for the winter, and some of them winter as far north as Mexico, like this blue-grey Nutcatcher, a very common and very active bird in the trees. And hereabouts the Wilson's Warbler, very yellow with a black top knot, is quite common. Also a migrant here, the blue grosbeak, a male here with extensive blue plumage and that very heavy bill that gives it its name. The short grassland around the archaeological site is favoured by quite a number of insectivorous birds. We've seen the flycatchers, but in the winter also birds looking for seeds. This is a Lark Sparrow, a very attractive bird with a big patch of white in its outer tail, a bird from the prairies of North America that spends the winter here. So as you can see from the colour of the grass, this is a dry area. It's semi-desert technically, and the canyon towhee is very much at home here. They shuffle about on the ground rather like a dunnock, although a size bigger. We usually see our first hummingbirds around Teotihuacan. This is a broad-billed hummingbird, and as usual it's seeking out tubular red flowers to take nectar from. The black-vented oriole is also taking nectar from the flowers of this tree, one of a number of oriole species that we encounter in Mexico. But here we might also find an endemic species. The yellow signs you'll see on some of the slides indicate that these are Mexican endemic species. Now this is the Rufus-backed robin, or Rufus-backed thrush, we should call it really. It's very much a thrush here eating a berry. And a rather thrush-like bird, but a size bigger with a long decurved bill. This is a curve-billed thrasher. Being semi-desert, there are plenty of cacti here, and these play host to the world's largest wren, the cactus wren, which is quite sizable. The Americas are really the home of wrens. We're very depauperate in Europe, and of course we only have the one species here, but many species in North and especially Central and South America. There are mammals too. This is the common rock squirrel, often seen running over the stonework of the archaeological ruins. And there are also a few of the little Mexican ground squirrel. Now we do see a few monarch butterflies and other butterflies in our February trips, but in November the grass, as you can see on that image, was rather greener, and there were a few more butterflies around. And this one in particular, the West Coast lady, you might guess it's closely related to the painted lady that we see in over much of Europe. A couple of birds to be seen in the rather lush surroundings of Mexico City's botanic gardens before we leave the city. This is a bird called the grey Silky Flycatcher, and you can perhaps see from the tone of its plumage that it has the same rather powdery feathering that waxwings appear to have. Hence the name Silky Flycatcher. And here a bird that steals nectar from the base of tubular flowers. So this is a flower piercer, and it is in fact a cinnamon-breasted flower piercer. You can just about see a rather vicious looking hook on the tip of the bill that it uses for making those holes. Okay, so we're now going to move about 50 miles west. This is actually in the lowlands of Michoacan, but close to the mountains where the monarch butterflies overwinter. This limestone canyon has a lodge that we use as a base. It's a fabulous place for wildlife and birds in particular, as well as having the most amazing rock formations. So one of the birds that we're often woken up to here with is the canyon wren. Very appropriate. It breeds in those limestone rock faces, but is not averse to walking up and down the rooftops of our accommodation and singing very loudly, a very loud descending song, rather like a willow warbler with a microphone. And here a young canyon wren waiting to be fed 1 year. At the base of the canyon, of course, a good river flowing through it, and here I'm sure you'll have no difficulty in recognizing a dipper, but without the white bib. This is an American dipper, behaves and sounds pretty much like the one we see in Britain. In the gardens, a good range of flowers attract hummingbirds. Now, not all hummingbirds are bright, sparkly birds. This one is a violet crowned hummingbird. And it's only when it puts its head in the right position that you can actually see the violet in the crown feathers. Pretty dull otherwise, though. Rather more splendid is the tiny little bumblebee hummingbird. One of the smallest birds in the world. There are quite a few woodpecker species to be found in Mexico. This is one of the commoner ones, but an endemic to the country, the golden-cheeked woodpecker. A very large and brightly coloured flycatcher, the great kiskadee, announces its presence with a very loud kiskadee call. The painted white start, also formerly known as the painted red start, although it has a white tail, hence white start, is a rather splendid addition to the trees down in the canyon. And where there are watercourses hereabouts, we might start to see a few dragonflies, maybe not so many in February as later in the year. This is well, we would know it as a golden ringed dragonfly. In America it's known as the Apache spiketail. I rather like the name. And another nice butterfly, beautifully marked, with rather simple colours, a tropical checkered skipper. Okay, so we're going to head up about 3,000 meters into the forests of Oyamel fir. About 350 square miles of these have been designated a World Heritage Site to protect the overwintering monarch butterflies. Up to 1 billion monarch butterflies are thought to overwinter here, or at least they have in the past. To be fair, there's been a very significant decline over much of North America in this species of butterfly, and now the numbers are possibly only 10%. 10% of a billion is still quite a lot of butterflies. Having said that, they cover really only a very small area, and there are less than a dozen locations, sometimes only a hectare or two in extent, where the butterflies concentrate. They migrate up to 5,000 miles from as far as Canada in the autumn, in what's been described as the most dramatic manifestation of the phenomenon of insect migration. Certainly they are very conspicuous. They're a large, as you can see, black and orange butterfly, so they're hard to miss. Nevertheless, it was only a few decades ago that the wintering sites were first found. They're not easy to find, they're not easy to get to. The caterpillars of the monarch butterfly feed on milkweed plants, and they concentrate toxins within the milkweed and then confer those toxins to the adult butterflies. So this black and yellow, black and orange coloration is all about warning colours. So as you can see here from the map, from the bulk of the North American continent, the monarchs move south and focus on these few small sites in central Mexico from about November through to February, early March. Having overwintered successfully, the butterflies then move north and will mate and have their first generation in northern Mexico or the southern United States. And from then, subsequent generations colonize or recolonize the rest of the continent. When they move south again in the autumn, they will feed up and actually have about 1/3 of their body weight as fat. Many of the other organs are shrunk to facilitate that. There are also some monarchs that spend the winter west of the Rockies in California, although as with the Mexican wintering monarchs, the numbers have declined dramatically in recent decades. They've discovered the flight routes and the migration patterns by tagging a good many monarchs, and here on the reserves you can donate $1 to put a tag on a monarch butterfly and hopefully one day get a return from it, but not many are recovered, to be fair. So as I said, it's not easy getting to these places. You can walk for an hour or two from base camps. The easy way is to take horses, maybe half an hour journey, and then another half an hour walking to the site. You're guided all the way by locals, and as you approach the hibernation sites, on sunny days some butterflies will be active, and they may well find you before you find them. There's plenty of nectar in the base of this fir forest, and the monarchs and other creatures make well use of those. Here you can see the clumps against the fir trunks, and also in particular hanging in huge bunches from the edges of the ends of the branches, sometimes weighing so much cumulatively that they break off branches. They don't have many predators. Any that do end up on the floor might be eaten by mice, but here is a black-headed grosbeak, a North American migrant, that will take a few, but they can only take a few at a time, and then they have to have a rest for a day or two before they can eat some more. As I say, quite often they end up on the ground, so you're asked to be very careful where you put your feet when walking under the hibernation sites. As I said, they do become very active on warmer, sunny days. Not all of them, but sometimes very large numbers will take flight. And because everyone is asked to whisper rather than talk loudly, you can actually hear the butterflies as they fly over en masse, which is quite awesome. Many of them are heading down to nectar to get energy, refuel, but also to take on water. It's quite important that they stay hydrated during the winter months. And these are areas, wet areas, where the butterflies concentrate. I mentioned there are other things taking nectar from the flowers here. This is a wonderful moth, excuse me, known as the princely tiger moth, very aptly named, with wonderful iridescent colours. And there's a snapshot of some of the red, white and blue flowers and yellow flowers in the undergrowth. Now you can see there are quite a few tubular red flowers there, and guess what? These attract a lot of hummingbirds, and prominent amongst them in the Oyamar fir forests is the white-eared hummingbird. There are also little bird parties going through the forest. This is one that looks rather like the firecrest of Europe. This is a golden-crowned kinglet, a resident bird here, as is the Mexican chickadee. But there are also migrant species accompanying these flocks. This is a Hermit Warbler, and here a Townsends Warbler. Townsends Warbler comes from the coniferous forests of the Pacific Northwest of North America. But the real prize to look out for in these bird parties is a real stunner, and it's an endemic too. This is, guess what? The red warbler, a real beauty, highly prized by visiting birders. On our visit last year in 2020, we were taken a short distance from one of the monarch sites to this stream set in rather nice meadows, and here we were told were axolotls. We were slightly incredulous. I had it vaguely in my mind that these were extinct in the wild. In fact, in Mexico they were thought to be extinct in 2013. They are now regarded as critically endangered, and along this stream, with a bit of care, we were able to see about 25 of them. They weren't terribly photogenic, and you can't clearly see the gills that they have. So these are quite large salamanders. They're termed neotenic, which means that they reach adult without metamorphosis. So they retain those external gills as breeding adults. So it was a real thrill and a big surprise to see those in 2020. Okay. Okay, we've headed over to the Pacific coast now. Puerto Vallarta is a winter holiday resort for many North Americans. It's a useful place to go and see the humpback whales that winter in Banderas Bay. They don't just winter here, they come to breed, in fact. So before you get on your boat for a morning out, you can take in the wealth in so many ways of this part of the world. Rich Americans certainly, but also wealth of birds. So flying overhead, frigate birds, the magnificent frigate bird, and another large bird, of course, also looking for fish, brown pelican. Out at sea, these will be seen plunge diving like gannets for food. And constantly flying around looking for scraps, the laughing gull. And on the rocks around the marina, a spotted sandpiper, the North American equivalent of the common sandpiper in Europe. But this would be a stranger to us. This is a young green heron, one that's lost its fear of humans and was proceeding to walk up and down, taking little fish from the shallows amongst the rocks. On the rocks, basking black iguanas, and also green iguanas, rather gaudy and bigger individuals. This one displaying by nodding its head. Sometimes these bask on trees in the sun and fall asleep, and if a breeze gets up, they may be prone to falling off into the water. At least they hope they fall into the water. Not so good if they fall onto the rocks, I think. Offshore, quite commonly here, the Heermann's gull, a sort of gull in reverse, a negative gull with a white head in adult breeding plumage. Now sometimes the humpbacks come quite close inshore. That's probably looking a little bit closer inshore than it actually is, but that's a young humpback whale that's practicing its tail splashes. The young are born around November time, and the females stay with them for several months during the winter, teaching them to swim and breathe, and also feeding them, of course, teaching them to wave their flippers around. So flipper waving is a very characteristic behaviour of humpback whales, and they also sometimes splash them down with tremendous splashes. And the young ones generally like to do rather more frolicking than the mothers. Surprise, surprise. This is what's known as tail lobbing, so it's like doing a headstand in the water. And when they dive, they don't dive terribly deeply because Banderas Bay is quite shallow. There's no feeding goes on in the winter months. All the feeding is done en route up the Pacific coast towards Alaska and beyond. So the females are basically fasting during the winter months. But when they do dive, they have that characteristic humpback shape, and if you're lucky, showing the tail flukes as they go. Many of them are heavily scarred, and some of these scarrings at least are a result of arduous males. So part of the reason the females are in Banderas Bay is to mate, find mates and mate. And when there's a party of several males and a female, then there's usually a lot of frolicking and a lot of splashing. Here's that wonderful fluke coming up. You can see the scars on this individual from the large barnacles that they often have. And then very characteristic patterns on the tail, on the underside of the tail fin, that enables them to be individually identified. And in fact, on our trips, our photographs have helped to identify quite a number of individuals that have been recorded in previous years, and sometimes from other locations. And we also take a hydrophone out and listen for the singing males, which is also quite an eerie experience, one of those events in nature that makes the hairs on the back of your neck stand up. Here's a young calf just about to make a bit of a splash. But they're very curious and pretty good with boats that come out to see them. There's a code of practice to keep your distance from the whales, but in fact the whales know better, and they will often come up to have a look. While you're watching the whales, there may be seabirds flying around. This is one of the most conspicuous seabirds, along with the pelicans and frigate birds in the Bay of Banderas. This is the blue-footed booby. So a relative of the gannet, and also plunge diving for fish like our gannet. Some of them breed on offshore islets, along with brown boobies. And on one occasion we found this peregrine of one of the North American races perched up on one of the rock faces. And on another very memorable occasion, we saw this red-billed tropic bird, one of a very small number thought to breed along the coast here. So let's go about 50 miles north to San Blas. That's the town you can just about see in the distance there. So a very interesting area for endemic birds, some wonderful forests in the coastal mountains. So things like the crested guan, here in a fruiting tree taking the fruit. Not so conspicuous and much smaller, the endemic Mexican parrotlet, a tiny little green leaf-sized bird, very difficult to see once they land. Another endemic, the Wagler's chachalaca. The chachalaca is, I think, onomatopoeic. These are very noisy birds, the chachalacas, and this one is found only in this part of Mexico. Another endemic, Mexican endemic bird, the black-throated magpie jay. This is the ivory-billed woodcreeper. Interestingly, has stiff, down-curved tips to the feathers, tail feathers, so uses them rather like a tree creeper uses them for support. And here, a lineated woodpecker drumming on a piece of dead timber. Very large woodpecker, crow-sized roughly, and one of two big woodpeckers that we see here, the other being the pale-billed woodpecker. Very colourful bird, but quite retiring in the forests, is the elegant trogon. And here a Ferruginous Pygmy Owl that's just caught what seems to be quite a large lizard, but in fact we are talking about quite a small bird here, so maybe not such a big lizard after all. These make a rather monotonous call. They're active during the day, as well as calling at night, and so they can be tracked down and seen in daylight without too much difficulty. So this is the very widespread Ferruginous Pygmy Owl, but here on the coast we have one or two locations to go looking for the Colima Pygmy Owl, slightly smaller and with pale spots rather than streaks on the crown. There are raptors overhead, typically turkey vultures, black vultures. This is a short-tailed hawk, a pale phase. They also come in a totally dark phase. And a grey hawk, a bird that's often seen perched like this on roadside wires. An extremely common bird on the roadside wires is the tropical kingbird, one of the most abundant birds on the west coast. And actually surprisingly common is the endemic Sinaloa crow, quite a small crow, glossy blue-black plumage, but often large flocks gathering together, particularly in the evenings, to roost. And here a purplish-backed jay, rather retiring member of the crow family. Near San Blas one might expect to see the San Blas jay, which is also an endemic, but ironically doesn't actually occur in the San Blas area. We have to go back towards Puerto Vallarta to see that one. Very gaudy, but also very retiring, the painted bunting, a male on the right of course, female on the left. And a few dragonflies. This is a Carmine Skimmer. And in the dry forests, sometimes one spots what appears to be a very large dragonfly hovering, and in fact you may be lucky enough to see one of these ornate helicopter damsels. So some of the largest dragonflies in the world in terms of length and wingspan. And in one very particular farm area, a small holding and a farmyard with a lot of dust and grain left behind from livestock, you may be lucky enough to see the elegant quails that are endemic to this part of Mexico. Mangroves traditionally coated much of the coastline hereabouts. Unfortunately, quite a lot of these have been cleared and shrimp ponds have replaced them. Now that's not all bad news from a bird watcher's point of view. Many of the wetland birds get a lot of food from the shrimp ponds. Many of the shrimp ponds are actually now disused, like this one. So they have great numbers of waders and other birds, like there's a roseate spoonbill there and some shovelers feeding. One of the prominent birds is the black-necked stilt, and the American avocet. And here's a curlew with a great big beak. This is a long-billed curlew. Usually associated with vegetated areas, to be honest. The American purple gallinule, like a large gaudy moorhen. And the soarer rail, usually hiding in swamps, sometimes coming out on the mud. And often skulking around underneath mangroves and around the edges of the shrimp ponds, the northern water thrush, a member of the North American Warbler family. They bob their tail constantly like a Sandpiper does. On the coast, where rivers meet the sea, there may be small numbers of birds you don't see elsewhere, like American oystercatcher. A very scarce bird here, the Reddish Egret. A ring-billed gull that I think is a migrant here from North America. And royal terns, along with Caspian terns and others of their ilk. Now, one of the treats of the tropics, if you can, is to get a boat trip into mangroves and see what is hidden within. They're very difficult areas to work apart from being in a boat. But one of the climaxes of our trip is a trip into the San Blas mangroves to see things like the mangrove swallow. This is a green kingfisher. Great blue heron is very common throughout the continent, really, along with snowy egret, subtly different from our little egret. The little blue heron, which rather awkwardly is all white in its immature plumage. And the Louisiana or tricoloured heron. So a boat trip through the mangroves guarantees you good views of a lot of these herons. This is a bare-throated tiger heron. A yellow-crowned night heron. And the strangest of all the herons, I think, the boat-billed heron, a sort of superficial resemblance to another nocturnal heron, the black-crowned night heron that we have in Europe. But just look at that bill. It's a very odd bird from some angles, and mainly a nocturnal feeder, crepuscular perhaps. Huge eyes give us a clue, of course, that it's a night feeder. So they hide up in the mangroves during the daytime. This is a bit of a one-off in the bird world, the limpkin. It's a snail feeder and the only one of its ilk. And superficially similar, you might think, is the white ibis. This is an immature bird, so not at all completely white like the adults. And here's a white ibis young bird, apparently dicing with death. I suspect this American crocodile was very well fed. It completely ignored the bird as it walked by. But I was ready to get, that series of great photographs of crocodile eating ibis. Fearsome creatures, really, when you're up close to them. This one, I think, is just waiting for something to come along and clean its teeth. And I was intrigued with this photograph because it wasn't until later on that I looked and realised that this actually has a tooth growing out through its upper jaw. I mentioned the limpkins eat snails. Well, this is another snail specialist, the Snail Kite. This is an immature snail kite, and you can see that incredibly long winkle picker of a mandible. So they feed on the apple snails, the large snails that are very common in this part of the world. Very rare, very rarely seen, and this seen from a boat, is a spotted rail. Very lucky sighting. And another lucky sighting actually was a daytime roosting nighthawk. So this is actually a lesser nighthawk. There are also common nighthawks that pass through Mexico, but these we see quite commonly, sometimes quite early in the evenings, taking flies over wetlands and agricultural land. Another nightjar, this time seen after dark. This is a paraque, which has a very noisy call, and in fact one calls in the field next to the hotel that we use in San Blas every night, and seemingly all night, but probably not so. But the nocturnal bird that we do go to try and find here, one of the specialities, is this bird here in daylight, looking like the end of a tree trunk. This is a northern potu, a large, long-tailed, nightjar-like bird with a huge gape. And after dark, they come alive, fly around, and sit on the tree stumps along the river, sometimes flying around after large insects. And then we can see those beady eyes that they have, and you can perhaps also appreciate the size of the gape going well below the eye there, backwards. Okay, so the trip through the mangroves, for many birders at least, the highlight of the trip and a good place to end the talk. I hope you've enjoyed it, and I hope you've got a flavour for some of the wildlife in these wonderful parts of Mexico. Thank you.